Welcome back. I'm Shane and this is Relative Time, and today I got something a bit different for you, as this is maybe the beginning of a new series that I'll come back to from time to time. Now, this is geared towards those who are new to watches and who are looking for their first watch. But even if you're a longtime collector, you still might find it interesting. So we'll go over 5 great watches that might start you down this deep, dark rabbit hole of horology. And to that end, I do have some criteria that a watch must meet to be included on this list. The first criteria is that they have to be affordable. I mean, even if you can afford a Rolex, I still think you should start by putting your foot in the shallow end of the pool, just to see what it's like. So everything on this list you should easily be able to find for less than $300, and some far less than that. The second thing is that they have to be easily accessible. I mean, as great as Helm watches are, I can't really expect someone new to stay up hitting the refresh button just to get a Komodo. So to that end, there are no limited editions and no hard to get, always sold out micro brands. And in fact, for this very first episode, there are no micro brands, and just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to stay away from AliExpress watches. And lastly, each watch has to have something unique or really interesting about it, to the point that it won't easily be replaced in a larger collection. And what I mean by that is that there are a lot of great affordable watches out there, and as your collection grows, so might your spending budget. And for a lot of people, a black or blue dial diver is one of the first watches you might buy, and that's a great versatile choice. Yet later on, you might buy a more expensive black or blue dial diver. And at that point, the first watch you bought might not ever get worn. So the watches I've picked have something unique about it or interesting enough about it that they could stay long-term in a larger collection and in some ways stand on their own against much more expensive watches. And I think that diver analogy is really a great segue to our first watch, which is the Orient Kamasu, and specifically the red burgundy Kamasu. At this point, the Kamasu is easily my most recommended watch. When I first got mine, it really was the new kid on the block, and a big unknown. In fact, back then, it wasn't even called the Kamasu, and that was almost 2 years ago. And since then, it's been kind of fun watching it slowly be embraced as one of the best entry-level divers out there. Now at this point, you shouldn't have much trouble finding one under $300. Even Orient USA, which is typically on the high end, has it for $280. There are some great divers out there for less money, and Orient even has a couple, but the Kamasu gives you pretty much everything you could want in an affordable diver. It has a good finish, Japanese movement, sapphire crystal, decent bezel, and great lume. But most important of all is that it's extremely comfortable and has a gorgeous dial. I think there are only 2 areas where the Kamasu is really lacking. The bracelet here is just okay, and it's not ISO rated. Although for me, the benefits here far outweigh those 2 areas. And nowadays, there are even some great aftermarket bracelets, if that is an issue. I absolutely love this funky strap code one I have on mine. I think the Kamasu is one of those watches that gets so much right, and most people would love it if they try it. There are a variety of colorways out there, and any of them would make a great choice. But for me, the red burgundy one is the one to get, and why I have it on this list, as I think this colorway lets it stand on its own even in a larger collection. The Kamasu gives you pretty much everything you could want in an affordable diver. But if in the future you wanted something more, and more of a high-end or luxury level dive watch, the odds are, whatever you're gonna get, it's not gonna look like this. Now onto the second watch on this list, and by the way, these aren't being presented in any particular order. Now if you're talking great affordable watches, and in particular what watch someone should get as their first one, then Seiko is definitely gonna come up. And most likely someone's gonna talk about their entry-level Seiko 5 line. Now, there are a lot of great watches in that lineup, such as the Ice Monster and the Bottle Cap. And some of those Seiko 5s have even achieved cult status, like the SNKL 23. And that's one that's surprisingly come back from the dead. Or at least for now it has. But the one we're going to talk about here is part of their newer Seiko 5 sports line. And while the first watches in that lineup were a bit underwhelming, the newer 40mm fixed bezel ones, the so-called Dress KXs, are surprisingly good. In fact, these may be one of the new go-to watches for someone's first automatic, and in some ways, Seiko has gone about creating a budget-friendly alternative to a Black Bay 41. I think most of the colorways could be included on this list, but the one I have here is the SRPE 61, and that's one I've nicknamed as the Silver Shadow. The overall design is sort of a smaller, dressier SKX, and that does sound kind of odd at first, but the end result really takes on a life of its own. With a great size, extremely comfortable, good lume, and in particular the silver one has an unusual and just killer dial, which looks fantastic with just about any strap you throw on it. And as typical with Seiko these days, you're not quite getting the value you might with some other micro brands. So these run in the low 200s, and you're not going to get sapphire, and this NATO strap is just okay. But with this silver dial, Seiko has created a watch that really straddles the line between dress and sport. And I think that makes it a watch that can easily stand on its own, even in a larger collection. Now, the third watch in this list is one I've kind of gone back and forth on, and just regarding its staying power in a larger collection. And we're talking about the Citizen EcoDrive Chandler Chronograph, but I thought I'd still present it and just see what you all think about it. Plus, I really wanted to include a field watch on this list, but for under $300, that can get a little tricky. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some great field watches out there for under that price, and especially so from Seiko. But some of the best field watches out there are going to be from Hamilton, and those usually run just above that price point, from around $400 to $600. And I'm talking about the Khaki Mechanical, the Khaki Field, or the Khaki King. Now, every once in a while you can find a Hamilton for under $300, and if you do, I highly suggest you get it. But even at their regular price, they are still fairly attainable. So I think people will often upgrade to one of those, and if they do, they never wind up wearing one of those first Seikos. And that is something that happened with me. So for a field watch, I was looking for something that would have a reason to stick around even after Hamilton was added to the collection. And I think this Citizen Chandler kind of fits the bill. Now, first off, this is an extremely affordable watch. It's usually under $200, but oftentimes goes on sale for about $100. It's very thin and very lightweight, so this is one you can easily strap to your wrist and just forget it's there until you need it. Yet it still has 100 meters of water resistance, so you don't need to worry about it getting wet. Now, as this is an EcoDrive, it is solar powered, so as long as it's getting some light now and then, it should be ready to go when you need it. Now, at this price, you're not going to get a lot of frills. It has a basic mineral crystal and a basic military style strap. And this is probably the least exciting dial on this list. Basically a black and white color scheme with Arabics and a train track chapter ring. But that high contrast design also makes it really easy to use. And rather than a 24-hour Arabic inner track that most field watches have, this one replaces that with 3 chronograph subdials for extra utility. And for me, that chronograph feature is the key to why I included it here. You don't often see a field watch chronograph, and I think everyone should have at least one go-to quartz watch. So even if you wind up getting a nicer Hamilton Khaki King, you still might wind up reaching for this one when you're in a rush. There are a lot of watches out there that have a cult following, and when it comes to the world of horology, you don't get more culty than a Vostok Amphibia. And this isn't about a specific model, but amphibias in general, as this Russian watch is the only one I know of that some have an entire collection of, which is easier to do than it sounds. Now, overall they are pretty cheap, usually starting around $70, and there are a ton of different cases and dial options out there, which range from wild to mild. So I think there's something out there for everyone, both in terms of style and wrist size. Now, ultimately, you are going to get what you pay for, and quality-wise, there really isn't any comparison to this and the Kamasu I recently talked about. And Vostoks have their own unique design quirks, and those quirks can bother some, such as a polymer crystal, brass components, bidirectional bezel, and of course a rather wobbly crown. Yet for some, those quirks are just part of its charm, as well as its history. This may be the cheapest watch I know of that has some true history and heritage, as the basic design of today's Amphibia isn't much different than what the Soviets came up with back in the 60s. They needed a 200-meter diver that was simple, robust, and easy to make, and that's exactly what they came up with. So no matter how many watches wind up in your collection, I think an Amphibia can stand on its own, if for no other reason than just have a conversation starter. Now, one of the downside to Amphibias is just how you get them. The best options are Marinome.com, Amazon, and eBay. But most of the sellers there are going to be based in Russia, and shipping isn't quite as quick or as reliable as it once was. Although there are some US-based sellers on both Amazon and eBay, but they usually charge a premium. And the last watch we have on this list is a bit square, as in G-Shock square. Now, just like the Vostoks, G-Shocks have their own cult following. The entire G-Shock line runs from ultra affordable to maybe a bit crazy, just as the technology runs from simple to a full-on navigation system. So there are a ton of options out there. Yet the G-Shock that started it all, and the one that I think most people start with, is one of the squares. There are a few different models, and the one you should get just depends on how much technology you want and how much you want to spend. Now, I went with a B5600, and that's one that has all the bells and whistles. But if I were to recommend one, I'd tell you to get something like a GWM 5610. And with that one, you're still getting solar power, world time, stopwatch, timer, as well as multiband. And I think multiband is kind of key, as it will automatically sync up the watch with the atomic clock, assuming you're within range of the signal. And that is pretty much the definition of set it and forget it. So far, I've only run across a couple of negatives with the one I have. The first of which is with the negative display, as it can be pretty hard to read, although there are plenty of G-Shocks out there that have a positive display. The only other downside is with the straps, and it's more if you want to change it to something else, you might need a third-party adapter. But the good news is that there are third-party parts out there, and including some aftermarket bracelets. A G-Shock Square may not have the classical beauty that some other watches have, but it sort of has its own retro geek aesthetic, as well as it's a watch that really is tough as nails, designed from the get-go to be used and abused. Which is why a lot of collectors, even some that own a few luxury watches, really love their G-Shocks and come back to them time and time again. It's a watch you never have to worry about. No matter what you're doing, you just put it on and go. Now, there might already be a good term for these kind of watches, but I've started thinking of them as alpha level watches. Alpha really being the first, and the watches that really spark that obsession, as well as opposite of omega level, which are more your grails. Anyway, that about wraps it up for today. Now, let me know down below not only what you think about these 5 watches, but if you have any good suggestions for a watch that could be included on this list for the next episode of this series. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.